Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Phillipson, and as Dean of the College of Law, I'd like to welcome you to our 2017 Wunusweh Lecture in Aboriginal Law, part of the College's McKercher Lecture Series. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we're on Treaty 6 territory on the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Before we begin, just a few words of thank you. I'd like to thank Candace and her staff for allowing us to host tonight's lecture in this beautiful facility. Thank you, Candace. I'd also like to thank the individuals and corporations who have donated to the Wunusweh Lecture Fund, including the Honourable Judge Gerald Moran, who is here with us this evening. Thanks, Judge Moran. I'd also like to acknowledge McKercher LLP for being the sponsor of the College of Law's Lecture Series. Their support allows the College to continue to present a wide range of informative, educational, and entertaining speakers to the law school and the community at large. Our speaker this evening is no stranger to the College of Law. Graduating from the college in 2008, Derek Nepinak is in his fifth year and second term as the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the largest political advocacy organization in Manitoba, with over 60 First Nations communities represented. Prior to his role at the AMC, Derek was the chief of his community, the Pine Creek First Nation in West Central Manitoba, where he was also the chairman of the West Region Tribal Council and sat on the Treaty 4 Executive Council for Manitoba. Derek has instituted a rights-based approach to Indigenous leadership grounded in inherent and treaty rights, which often runs in contrast to programs, services, and policies within the Indian Act system. However, before that, Derek's real claim to fame that is he was a student in my first-year property class. And I remember Derek vividly because I had a little trick with all my students in my tutorials, and I would get the students to tell me their favorite piece of property, and we'd have a discussion about why that was a piece of property, and I'd always give people names. And if you know Derek and you know about Derek, lots of people had their stuffed animals and their cuddly toys and their sort of first car and this kind of stuff. Derek's favorite piece of property, which I reminded him about at dinner, and he laughed and then said I could actually tell you this, was his chainsaw. So I'll leave it at that. Derek has a first-class honours BA from the University of Alberta. As mentioned, he has a law degree from the University of Saskatchewan, and he completed the intensive program in Indigenous Lands, Resources and Governance at Osgoode Hall Law School, and was partially through his master's degree in Indigenous Governance at the University of Winnipeg when the call of leadership came and he had to give up his studies to become Grand Chief. While attending law school, Derek was recognized for his work in the community and his legal writing. He earned the Roger Carter Scholarship from the Native Law Centre at the University of Saskatchewan, as well as the Best Student Submission Award to the Indigenous Law Journal at the University of Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Grand Chief Derek Nepinak.
Miigwech. My name is Derek Nepinak, and I'm the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and I've just introduced myself in my Anishinaabe language. I said I am Summer Bear, and I'm of the Bear Clan. I'm from the Pine Creek Anishinaabe people, and that's further to my language. I want to recognize the territory that I'm speaking on this evening, a territory that I called home for many years, and that's a Treaty 6 territory. It's a great honor to be here this evening, to be invited to this very prestigious lecture series put on by Chief Moran and the Native Law Centre, the University of Saskatchewan. I see a lot of familiar faces here this evening, and I'm very honored to share with you some of the pathway of life that I've been on over the last number of years, and to frame some of that within the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, but also to put it perhaps within a treaty perspective or a treaty context that may not be all that popularly spoken of yet. So, lots to talk about. I'm going to do my best. Over the last number of days, I've been suffering from some kind of flu that I think I may have picked up when I was out a little further west. I was in Edmonton with a lady by the name of Jane Fonda. Some of you may have heard some of the discussion coming out of her trip to the tar sands territory. Well, anyways, I had the honor of sitting with her and doing a little bit of media and public awareness around tar sands expansion. And while I was out there, I somehow picked up a bit of a flu. I spent 3 days in bed so that I could come here, hopefully recovered enough to be able to share with you this discussion, which I find to be a discussion that we all need to have about reconciliation and what that means in today's world. In order for me to talk about these things, however, I must first, I think, frame myself within the context of the discussion. I must frame the perspective for myself. And, I come from a background where we don't often put a lot in titles. I think I come from a background and a family where a lot of our credibility within our family comes from what we do and who we are within our family. And I think that that's kind of where I got to start, because when we strip away titles, we're all broken down just to being human beings, all struggling in similar ways to get through this challenging thing that we call life. As I said, I come from the Pine Creek First Nation, and many people conceive of their identity and the geography of their First Nation within the reserve boundaries. And I've done my best to make sure that I don't. I remember a time when we were called the Pine Creek Indian Band, and for some reason we started calling ourselves the First Nation. And I think that's oftentimes how communities get caught up in the glamour of working and operating within the English language, is to take the best terms we can use and try to use them within our own context. So we became a First Nation after first being the Pine Creek Indian Band, and I'm okay with being called the Pine Creek Indian Band, and I refer to us that way. When I think about where I come from, we actually have a fairly small reserve. We have a band membership of about 3,500 Anishinaabe people. But when I think about the boundaries of our territory, I think about where I know the trails, and I think about where I can go hunting. So where I can go hunting takes me to the top of the Riding Mountain, the national park. It takes me into the Duck Mountains. It takes me into the Kettle Hills. And it takes me into Treaty 4 territory in what's now called Saskatchewan. That's my traditional territory, and my relations along the way have created a path for me to be able to hunt in those territories. And that's what I consider to be my territory. I'm also, able to go out onto the waters, Lake Winnipeg-Osis, and cast a net and pull out some pickerel from time to time. That's how I define who I am and the geography that I come from. I try not to live within that prescribed context of this is your reserve boundary. On this side, you're a status Indian. On that side, you're not. I've always done my best to make sure that we don't think of ourselves that way. So I was born at the St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My mom was a residential school student when I was born, and she took me and brought me home to the Pine Creek Indian Band, where I lived with my great-grandparents. In our household, there was upwards of 10 or more of us in the household at any one time, and there was 4 small bedrooms in our little house. And we didn't have any running water in our home, and we relied on a wood-burning stove to get us through the cold winters. And I recall having a discussion with my mom recently, thinking about how a lot of Canada at that time was already enjoying running water and indoor plumbing and central air, and we didn't have any of those things. But we were okay the way we were because we still took care of ourselves. And I can remember my grandma was one of the ones in the community that always worked with the moose hides. So whenever anybody hunted, they'd always bring her the moose hide because she would be able to turn it into material for clothing and for shoes. And I remember watching her do that when I was a little guy. And we always kept our own garden, and I can always remember my uncles bringing meat home, and that was moose meat and deer and elk from the hills. My grandpa was a fisherman, and I can still remember being there on the shores of the lake watching him bring the nets home and bringing home full tubs of ugly fish. So I can remember those days, and I believe that was a representation of our self-sufficiency as a family. And it was what I remember, and it's what I've always held on to as I've gone out into the world to figure out who it is that I'm supposed to be in this Western society that sprung up around us. So, as I'd mentioned, I'm the first generation not to go to residential school. My mom went there, and she went at a time when I would say there was a significant I guess, narrative that had developed amongst the teachers in the schools that there's no sense in you Indians going home when you leave this school. You should go out into the world and try and find jobs. And that, to me, was, I think, a very distinct moment in the history of our family, because my mom's generation began going out into the cities, so leaving the reserves and going out into the urban environments, and we lost a number of family members along the way. Some people call it the 60s scoop, the 70s scoop, but there was also a lot of people who just went missing, and a lot of people in my family, not only went missing, but people also turned up dead in those days. That to me is something that we need to focus more on, and I'm hoping that the inquiry that we're going to be having here is going to reflect upon those days when the residential schools started to close and a lot of our people started going out and venturing beyond the reserve boundary into broader society. I think I heard it here by one of our learned teachers that we became refugees in our own territory, because when our people started going out into urban settings, there was no programs or services in place for us to help us make that transition, to deal with the culture shock that we went through. So that is a lot of my context for where I began this process. And I do have a lot of successes, in the academic circles that I've been in, except for Martin's first year property class, of course. But a lot of that is built, I think, on failures, because oftentimes you have to fail first before you can succeed in life. And I struggled through, many of the trails that I've been on. I'm not a fluent speaker today of the Anishinaabe language. I do a lot of the ceremonies where I can speak and I can pray in our language, but I'm not as conversational as I would like to be. And for a long time I felt ashamed, as a young person being in leadership, that I wasn't fluent, and the elders could sit around me at the band office when I became chief and they could talk in the language, and some of the things that they were saying I couldn't understand. But I learned along the way that we can't be ashamed for some of the things that we've lost along the way. We have to acknowledge that we're in a time now where these things can come back very strong, including our languages. And I was very honored recently, in that context, to be able to put my daughter into a grade 1 class that's a bilingual Ojibwe and English class. And it's the first of its class, it's the first of its kind in, I think, in the history of the Manitoba education system. And to me, that represents how we've come full circle. We went from a day and age when my mom was in residential school where the language was beaten out of her into a time when we can once again celebrate our language, and our young people can be raised in their language to be proud of who they are. Recently, I was driving home after picking up my daughter from grade 1, and she said to me, "Dad, you know what?" She said, "I can't sing O Canada the way we're talking right now." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that, the way we're talking right now?" She goes, "Yeah, the way we're talking." She said, "I can't sing O Canada, I can only sing it in Ojibwe." So she says, I said, "Oh, so you mean you can't sing it in English?" She goes, "Yeah, I can't sing it in English. I can only sing O Canada in Ojibwe." And that brought so much pride, to me in hearing that, just because of the significant challenges we faced as a family, in our language. I went and started the master's program after I had graduated from the law school here, because I didn't feel grounded enough in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous legal traditions, having graduated from law school. I was one of those students that came here looking at the Aboriginal law components of the programs here, thinking that I was going to learn about Indigenous law. And what I learned was how Western laws applied to Indigenous people. So I guess in that realization and going through that discovery, it became challenging for me to function in this environment, because I had a great yearning, like many young people did. I was early in my 30s at the time, to become grounded in who I was, in my identity, but also in the legal traditions, and that meant ceremony. So I was lucky enough to meet a few people here along the way. Paul Chartrand was teaching here at the time, and he hooked me up with the community elder who brought me into ceremony. And I think that it was that time spent in ceremony that really got me through some of the difficulties that I experienced here as a law student. I sat in the library, reading the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and being brought to tears as a grown man, seeing that our trauma was being reduced into matrices for compensation values. And I really, really struggled with that, just as many of our people did along the way. And I would be able to find refuge when I'd go to the ceremonies and the sweat lodges in the area to try to overcome the pain and the hurt that I felt from that. So that's kind of how I got through the law school experience. And when I went into the master's program, it gave me the freedom to think within an Indigenous context, something that I had already had developed through my participation in my family and in our culture. So I went home in October for a family dinner, and it was at that family dinner where my aunties around the kitchen table said, "Derek, it's time for you to come home and be a leader now." And I said, "Well, I'm not ready. I'm still having fun doing my master's degree." They said, "Well, it's time for you to come home because we need you to do some work here." Not thinking that I would win in a popular election, I decided to put my name in for the chief back home, and this was in 2008. And I did the best I could. I put together a campaign package that I thought might win the election. I put together a team that would help me, navigate through some of the families in the community, and I won the election. I beat the incumbent. The incumbent was Billy Joe Delaron, who's a very well-known name in Manitoba, former leader of the Manitoba Métis Federation, who had done 2 terms in my community. So, having won the election, I came home and had nowhere to live. I was basically homeless, so I stayed at my aunt's place for the time being, and I began working around the clock to figure out what it was to be a community chief. I share these ideas with you to provide a little bit of contextual background for some of the things I'm going to say a little later on that may be a little bit hard-hitting, that may be a little bit provocative. But I mean no disrespect to anybody in leadership as I move into some of this discussion. I've been, for whatever reason, I think I've been able to make observations along the way in my political life and being a community leader that I wouldn't have been able to make had I not gone through the education process that I've been through. So I feel that all the years I spent in school, prepared me for the types of learning that I would do as a chief back home. I saw a very significant challenge as a chief back home, and what I saw primarily was that we were living as a community with a sense of defeat. A sense of defeat that was prescribed over and over again by the consequences of colonization. We had largely become disconnected as families. Instead of relying on one another, we relied on the band office for every solution that we needed. There was a time when our families came together and we built all the houses we needed for all the families that lived at home. But we're living in a time now, when I came home as chief, that everybody wanted a house and they wanted it free and they wanted it built by the band. And I had pondered how and when this transition had happened, because when I was a little boy, this wasn't the dynamic that I was living in. When I was a little boy back home, nobody went to the band office for help. Everybody had a degree of self-sufficiency. So somewhere along the way between the 1970s, early 80s, and the first decade of the 21st century, we became completely dependent on what the band office would bring. And I stepped right into that dynamic. We were in third-party management, which is part of the intervention program that's administered through the Regional Office of Indian Affairs. And to be in third-party management means that you have no control over your local finances. All of your band contribution funding is under the control of an accounting firm. The accounting firm takes about $20,000 to $25,000 a month off the top of your band contribution funding and then spends the rest on attempting to administer underfunded budgets to the detriment of your community. I reviewed the corporate manuals from the Treasury Board. Realizing that if you read a few things, you might be able to figure a few things out. I saw how the intervention program worked. I negotiated with our creditors, and I was able to take us out of third-party management in 8 months. And according to the region, that's the fastest that any First Nation community had ever taken their community out of third-party management in Manitoba. So I felt proud of what I did, because I didn't know any better. In time, I would learn that I fell right into the hands of the department. The department works on the rationale, and the intervention program is built on the rationale that communities don't have capacity to work with their own finances. And by building that capacity and taking over our finances, I basically affirmed, that colonial thinking. I've seen other chiefs in the past do it in other ways. One of my colleagues, Terrence Nelson, formerly the Grand Chief of the Southern Chiefs Organization, when he was chief, he said, keep your third-party programs. We're going to work on develop our own source revenue. So I've seen different ways of doing it, but it was my task to get us out of third-party management, which is what I did. In beginning to learn fiscal policy and how money moves within the community, I began to recognize that the money that comes into the communities through contribution funding agreements, it's not real money. It's not like the money that you have in your pocket right now that you get to go and spend on your own personal priorities. The money in the band contribution funding agreements is the most heavily encumbered currency that you'll ever recognize or ever have to work with in an institutional format. Because you see, the budgets that communities work with under the contribution funding arrangements are prescribed, and each line item is fixed. So you cannot take your band contribution funding that the government provides you and spend it on community priorities as are defined by the community. You have to spend it on priorities defined by Indian Affairs policy, which is set in Ottawa and dictated through the region. And oftentimes those priorities don't align with what needs to happen in your community. And if you take that band contribution funding dollar and you spend it on a band priority outside of the prescribed budget, that becomes an overpayment, and that becomes a clawback. Many communities get into a perpetual state of trying to do that, trying to move money towards priorities and getting caught in overpayments and clawback situations. And my community was no exception. In fact, on December 24th of 2008, I received a fax from the Regional Department of Indian Affairs saying that there was an $800,000 overpayment to the Pine Creek First Nation, which I had to figure out how to repay. So I did a little bit of a legal review, and I hired my lawyer to take a look at these overpayments that were alleged, flowing out of social development programs that our community relied on, social development programs that kept food in the cupboards for a lot of our most impoverished families. And although the department maintained that we owed them that money, the department could not prove that that money was misspent. So what I did was I invited the department into the band office and I said, if you're going to get us to pay you back this $800,000 overpayment, you're going to have to prove to us that it was misspent or misallocated. And they couldn't do that. So they backed off. Now I mention that, but I also keep in mind that many communities are in repayment mode of overpayments, which means that they're repaying debt that's being created essentially out of thin air because of an alleged misallocation of funds under their contribution funding agreements. And I can only speak to this because this is what I had witnessed as a chief in my community. I won my second election in a landslide with over 500 votes from the community, a big turnout for us. And the work that I had done early on had been reaffirmed. It was during my second term as the chief in Pine Creek where I became approached by some of the chiefs of Manitoba to consider taking on the role of Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Now the AMC is the largest political organization in Manitoba. We have 62 member First Nations communities, and those communities represent about 150,000 Indigenous people. I took on the role. I put my name in, not thinking that I would win the election, and I won it. And it was from that vantage point that I made the transition from being a community chief to the Grand Chief. And early on in my tenure, I met with then Deputy Minister Michael Wernick, reflecting on and learning what the organization was all about. I learned that many of our political organizations, our regional political organizations, are agents. They are agents or were agents of provincial and federal policy and law. That is, when governments want to make a change in a policy or want to pass legislation, they use our organizations, our political organizations, our regional and our national organization as a flow-through for consultation dollars to implement their policies. It's a very top-down approach, and I saw us as an organization working that way. So I agreed to take on the task of running the organization. And I met with Michael Wernick, then Deputy Minister, and I said, we're no longer going to push your mandate, as the top bureaucrat within the department. We're going to start pushing a mandate that comes from our communities, that comes from our leadership. And his response to me was that, well, things are going to get very quiet here in Manitoba. Within 6 months, the organization received word from the department that we were going to receive a core funding budget cut from $2.7 million down to $500,000 to run our organization with. And this was at the height of the Harper era omnibus bills. So, coupled with a very ambitious conservative agenda to strip away environmental protections and treaty rights, came a significant budget cut to our political organizations. Now, one may put all the focus on the government of the day if you want to say, look what bad things they've done. But we also have to ask ourselves within our political organization, why did we not build our own capacity to operate outside of government funding? And to that point, for 25 years, an organization called the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs had operated completely from government transfers on an annual basis. We had developed no equity. We had developed no net worth of any kind. The only net worth we had was in our boardroom tables and our chairs and our laptop computers. That's the equity that we had to build from. And over 25 years, easily $250 million or more had gone through our organization. So why was there no equity? Why haven't we built that capacity at a regional level? We didn't do it. And I recognize that as a huge problem, and it's still a huge problem for our political organizations across the country that rely completely on government funding for political advocacy. I would say that today that's one of the most significant problems we have at the Assembly of First Nations, but also regionally. In my process, I had to turn away money that came from the government that tried to push us through certain policy directives of the federal government. For example, they offered us a fairly significant amount of money to affirm the First Nations Election Act, which may be now being implemented in many communities across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, which changes the terms from 2 years to 4 years for chiefs and councils. I stood against that. I said, no, I'm not going to take your money, Deputy Minister, to stand with you at a press conference. We are going to actually take a critical approach to your bill, and I'm going to say that your bill is unconstitutional, which is what I did. And you don't win any friends in the public service when you're standing against policies that they had been writing for the last several years. That law, nonetheless, has come to pass, and many communities are now making that transition into the First Nations Election Act, which provides an express provision for the minister to set aside an election result, which to me is an infringement on the treaty right. So I reflect upon these things because I think it's very important to frame how we operate politically right now. There's a lot of promises that come out of politicians, whether it be federal or provincial government, but also from our own communities. And I had found that after working in this area for a number of years that the political rhetoric has no depth. When you get past a lot of the platforms, the stages, there's no capacity to actually bring about a lot of the transformational changes that are identified in reports and recommendations like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. there's no depth beyond striking committees and having ambitious discussions about what things should be like or what they could be like. There's no capacity to build those transitional pieces we need to really focus on who we are as nations of people. There's no depth beyond, our annual meetings, our executive meetings, to get to the core of what it might look like, as original nations in real negotiations with the nation of Canada. And that's really, I think, an observation that I've made after having spent almost a decade here. I went into the role as a chief thinking that my legitimate victory in a democratic process allowed me to advance treaty rights, what I believe to be flowing from inherent responsibility to our land, to our governance structures, to our children, to our education systems. And I proceeded in that way for a number of years, always pushing the envelope, challenging, all the structures every bit of the way. I never really reflected upon the role of the chief as it's prescribed in the Indian Act. I always saw it as something much bigger than that, as something that held much more responsibility. I held on to that through the entirety of my work. And, I haven't decided whether or not that was the best way to do it yet, because perhaps we've come to a time now where we have to reflect upon the limitations of the role of a chief and council within the prescribed governance system of the Indian Act. Because I did the very best I could within that space. I stopped signing contribution agreements, for example. I saw the contribution funding agreements as, the affirmation of the administration of our poverty as a community. And I did not want to, as a leader, be the administrator of our poverty. So I stopped signing the contribution agreements, and I encouraged everybody within the treaty lands in the Northern Plains to stop signing their confirmation funding agreements. That created a bit of a problem for, the Minister Valcourt at the time, who then passed an Accountability and Transparency Act, which has been challenged, by, I understand, by the Onion Lake community. But I saw it as a detriment to what we're trying to achieve in terms of accountability. There's never been a question about accountability on band funding. I've worked with leaders who have always been transparent in how they do their work and in how the money is administered within their communities. Now, with that said, in Manitoba, 2/3 of our communities don't control their funding. 2/3 of our communities in Manitoba are under some kind of intervention, whether that be co-management or third-party management. So you need to, I think, put that into the context of, accountability and transparency, who's actually making the decisions on how money moves in our communities. So moving forward a little bit, I looked to a little bit of the academic work that was done by Mary Eberts. And I think she wrote a paper when she was here, or she did a series of lectures or a couple lectures about challenges that we face, as Indigenous people, and some of the strategies that are used in bureaucracy and law. And she basically concludes that we're going through an ongoing state of internalized colonization, and it continues to inform the relationship between ourselves and the state. And she identified two strategies that are being used. One, Indigenous peoples become extinct in fact by dying out, intermarriage, and urbanization, or extinguishing our will to resist assimilation. Secondly, which is more common, is to attempt to extinguish the rights of Indigenous people to their territories and self-government. And I tend to agree with her on that finding. I think that if we're going to have a talk about truth and reconciliation recommendations, we need to talk about the ongoing state of colonization that we're in. By dying out, we're talking about, I believe, the extinction of the status Indian. And I have talked about that on more than one occasion. I've talked about the creation of the legal identity being the status Indian. And, there's been various pockets of our communities that this discussion has resonated with. But those who are enjoying positions of power within this legal structure, being the Indian Act and its hierarchical chief and council political organization system, it doesn't resonate well with them, because I think a lot of people are hesitant to challenge those things that make them comfortable. And the issue being that one of the fundamental, I think, precepts of being self-determining is to determine who your people are. And I find that as long as we're allowing a bureaucracy called the Department of Indigenous Affairs to determine for us who the Indian is, we're not going to be self-determining. And this is reaffirmed time and time again when people take the issue of status Indianship to the courts to have declarations made that they're eligible to be status Indians. They're relying on individual rights, individual liberal rights that they can find under the Charter to piecemeal and take apart, the Indian Act and what it is to be a status Indian. I don't find that helpful to us. I think that we need to go through a process to redetermine who we are as Indigenous people. How do we define nationhood amongst ourselves as Anishinaabe people or as Cree people? And that really is the process that we need to venture out on. If we continue to allow the Indian Act to determine for us who is a status Indian, we will become extinct, because it is a mathematical certainty that over time, more and more people fall off the ban list of the status Indian. And if you're not on the ban list, it means that you're not going to be recognized for programs and services that are funded by the government. And if you're not a status Indian, you're not entitled to be part of an Indian band. And in time, if there's no status Indians, there's not going to be any Indian bands. And if there's no Indian bands, there's no need to have reservation land set aside or reserve land set aside. That's kind of how the Indian Act works, and I believe that that's working against us. So I have often said it's time for us as Indigenous people to step outside of that Indian Act system. And I've had many people come up to me and say, you know what, you're doing it wrong. You're trying to implement Trudeau's 69 white paper. And I hear that message, and I have studied the 69 white paper very, very thoroughly. And I believe that we live in a Canadian society where the effecting of the 69 white paper is no longer legally possible. And I say that because, one, of Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, but also years and years and a couple of generations of work of political leaders, as well as, the establishment of legal precedent in Canadian law. And that means that we need to rely and look on Canada's Constitution, but also our inherent responsibilities under treaty to think about who we might be outside of the Indian Act. And I'm not going to sway away from that understanding, because I've earned it and I've fought for it. I've worked very hard to come to a place where I can say yes, for us to be outside of the Indian Act would be the ideal place for us to venture out into a new nationhood, a nationhood that could actually engage with governments on a nation-to-nation basis, because that is a very popular rhetoric of the day. Unfortunately, a lot of our communities believe that nation-to-nation means the Prime Minister meets with your chief in your village. And I don't think that that's what it is. I believe that there is a power aggregate, a political governance structure that exists beyond the Indian Act, which represents and recognizes legitimate leadership on traditional leadership lines. And we have to start doing that work if we hope to ever engage on a nation-to-nation basis. And I believe that that is much our responsibility as it is, for governments in the development of that nation-to-nation dialogue. I don't believe that the AFN, as a national organization, can build that aggregate or build that message, because it is an organization that's solely reliant on federal government funding, but maybe more importantly than that, it's an organization that I guess is co-opted, just as many other organizations are that rely on government money. So, the other way that is mentioned here by Mary Eberts is to attempt to extinguish the rights of Indigenous people to their territories and self-government. Now, I wanted to make a brief comment on that in the context of reconciliation, or the implementation of recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How can we reconcile if we're not going to reconcile with the natural world around us? How can we reconcile what happened to us in the dispossession of our culture, our language, and our land if we're not going to talk about the land issue? The day that the final report was being read into the public record by Murray Sinclair and by the Prime Minister in Ottawa, that day that was happening, conservation officials from the province of Saskatchewan raided 2 houses on the Pine Creek First Nation. In raiding 2 homes on the reserve, they confiscated rifles and they confiscated meat, moose meat, that was taken in the territorial boundaries of Saskatchewan. I became aware of what was happening in my home community, and I was actually at the event in Winnipeg, marking the announcement. So I was dressed like I am today. And when I found out, my first instinct was to drive home to protect the sovereignty, the food sovereignty, and the jurisdiction of our community over our ancestral lands. And that meant doing what would need to be done to demonstrate that we're not going to bend to the application of provincial jurisdictions over our right to food. So the reason why I bring this up is because there's a dichotomy that exists. There's a dichotomy that exists between things that are being said and things that are being done on the land. How can we hope to repair damaged relationships if Indigenous people are not allowed to go out onto the land and take food for our families? Because to be an Indigenous man from my community, from my family, means that I have responsibilities to bring food home. And for a considerable amount of time, I have been one of the men who, goes out onto the land and harvests meat for my freezer, harvests meat to share with the elders in my community. And if I'm doing that, and I'm meeting conservation officials who believe for some reason they have a jurisdiction to stop me, to confiscate my catch, then there's a very, very significant problem. Because there are very few things we can do that are more fundamentally important than have the right and the ability to harvest the traditional foods of our people. So I think about that in the context of reconciliation. And I've thought about it each and every day that I've been asked to think about, how do we effect reconciliation in this day and age? The commission, of course, was established in 2008. And it was mandated to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools in a manner that documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Aboriginal people. Honor the resilience and courage of former students, their families, and communities. And guide and inspire a process of truth and healing, leading towards reconciliation within families, between people and non-Aboriginal communities, churches, governments, and Canadians generally. The process was to work to renew relationships on the basis of inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect. Now, of course, being a national discussion, there's going to be differing views on the concept of reconciliation. Excuse me. I think it's fair to say that some in the Indigenous community have dismissed the concepts and the TRC recommendations as mere distractions to the real day-to-day issues that continue to plague the lives of Indigenous people. For example, Jeff Corntassel, an academic, refers to the politics of distraction, which includes narratives around the concept of reconciliation, which identifies processes that are merely reinscribing the status quo or frames our community relationships in state-centric terms. These narratives become tools of shape-shifting colonial entities to separate us from our homelands, cultures, and communities. Countering reconciliation narratives is the concept of resurgence, which takes away the emphasis from state frameworks of forgive and forget back to relocalized, community-centered actions premised on reconnecting with the land, culture, and community. Corntassel goes on to suggest reconciliation without meaningful restitution merely reinscribes the status quo without holding anyone accountable for ongoing injustices. At its core, reconciliation has a religious connotation premised on restoring one's relationship with God. Reconciliation in practice tends to relegate all committed injustices to the past while attempting to legitimate the status quo. Tayaki Alfred states, the logic of reconciliation as justice is clear. Without massive restitution, including land, financial transfers, and other forms of assistance to compensate for past harms and continued injustices committed against our people, reconciliation would permanently enshrine colonial injustices and is itself a further injustice. So I share that with you because that's part of, I think, the dialogue that's happening out there, is that reconciliation does not happen until the land issue is incorporated in there. And reflect upon a comment by my late friend, Art Manuel, who recently left this world. He spoke of reconciliation in the context of Indigenous people being forced to within 0.02% of our original land. And how can you reconcile human experiences without considering the reciprocity in our relationship to those lands? Now, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission thought about these issues. And when I reviewed the final report, I pulled out a couple of points I thought that were important to add some context. Residential schools are a tragic part of our history, but they can't be simply consigned to history. The legacy from the schools and the political and legal policies surrounding their history continue to this day. This is reflected in the significant education, income, health, and social disparities between Aboriginal people and other Canadians. It's reflected in the intense racism some people harbor against Aboriginal people and in the systemic and other forms of discrimination Aboriginal people regularly experience in this country. It's reflected, too, in the critically endangered status of most Aboriginal languages. So, it's important to reflect upon the complexity of this discussion, and I think that in identifying that there's going to be a diversity of opinions brought forward, the Commission looks to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as an appropriate framework to initiate and I think implement that discussion around reconciliation. And to that end, I noticed that the final report made reference to James Anaya, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur, who made a special trip to Canada. I think it was in 2013. He visited us in Winnipeg, and we organized a bit of a rally for him at the corner of Portage and Main, to the dismay of the noon hour traffic. So James Anaya speaks to the Declaration as perhaps best to understand the Declaration and the right of self-determination as it affirms as instruments of reconciliation. Properly understood, self-determination is an animating force for efforts towards reconciliation, or perhaps more accurately, conciliation, with peoples that have suffered oppression at the hands of others. Self-determination requires confronting and reversing the legacies of empire, discrimination, and cultural suffocation. It does not do so to condone vengefulness or spite for past evils or to foster divisiveness, but rather to build a social and political order based on relations of mutual understanding and respect. That is what the right of self-determination of Indigenous people and all other peoples is about. I've taken that comment to heart. As a political leader, it's my responsibility to always look towards optimism, always look towards the hope that we have living within a complex and diverse social society. I was taught, in terms of the treaty relationship, that there were three parties to treaty. And when I say three parties, I'm referring to people, the land, and the Creator. Now notice when I talk about people, I'm not talking about the diversity of races of people. I'm just talking about people. Because certainly when we look at the ceremonies that went into treaty making and the ceremonies that are done today to affirm treaty, we have to look, beyond identity politics and those things that divide us, racially or economically or socioeconomically, and come together as one people, as one family, all living within, these ancestral lands, all living within treaty. So when I think about the context of self-determination, and I think about how that feeds into the United Nations Declaration and discussions about free, prior, and informed consent, and whether or not Indigenous people have a veto power on the basis of free, prior, and informed consent, I think that's the wrong way to frame the discussion. I think that when we look at our responsibilities under a treaty to make constructive and visionary decisions together, I think that we have to look beyond these divisive forces that exist in popular politics. And that divisive force I'm talking about is us versus them. or that divisive force that exists when we talk about treaty, as in you owe me something because I'm a treaty Indian. I don't ascribe to that anymore, and I don't believe in it. What I do believe in is mutual responsibility. So when it's said that I implemented a rights-based approach to Indigenous leadership, that is where I started from. I started from an idea that our rights weren't being recognized. And I had built up that anger, and I had built up that forcefulness of my message because I was upset and I was hurt by what I had seen in going home to become a leader back home. I had become hurt and I had become upset because I hadn't been grounded enough in the ceremonies and in the teachings of the old people back home to bring me back to a place of balance. So some of the things that I did along the way that became public, meaning not going to Stephen Harper's meeting in 2012, marching on the streets of Ottawa, some of the other crazy things I did. A lot of that was based in certain bits and pieces of my own anger, my own healing that I needed to do. Things changed for me somewhere along the way. We had recognized that what we need to do in working with our elders, in building a new organization or a new way forward in dealing with government that won't listen, is we need to start rebuilding from the ground up. And that meant putting children first. And with the extremely high rates of child apprehension in Manitoba, I believe we're up over 10,000 children that have been apprehended by the CFS system. We recognized that we needed to start at our own kitchen tables to rebuild our families, and that meant providing an advocate for families. Every province has its own children's advocate's office, but that advocate's office is prescribed by law. It's very limited in what it can do. A family advocate, which we created out of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, is not prescribed by statutory limits or regulations. People wondered what it could do, and I said, well, it can do exactly what it is that you let it do. If you're going to be guided by Indigenous principles, Indigenous institutions, or the resurgence thereof, you've got to let our people come in to hear the story and to help guide families back together. And slowly we've been building this office over the last couple of years. It's not government funded, so we don't have to account for the dollars that we put into that office back to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, either provincially or federally. It's a standalone office. It came from ceremony, and it continues to grow from ceremony. That was the starting point for the rebuilding of the organization. And as I said, we as an organization, we have a little bit of money coming in now because over my time we built a casino. It's not like the big casinos here that make millions and millions of dollars. It makes a little bit of money, and we put that to the most important thing that we can. That is the future of our children at the Assembly. So we've moved past a rights-based discourse or a rights-based rhetoric and have actually began taking action-oriented steps. And you can see in implementing action-oriented processes that my rebuttals and my rhetoric is less perhaps offensive, towards federal governments, and more introspective, recognizing that we've got our own work to do as Indigenous people in restoring traditional institutions of governance and restoring family cohesion, because a community can't be healthy unless you have strong families, and families can't be strong without strong individuals. And that's what we believe needs to happen. So to that end, I'm just going to end on this note. We believe that the implementation of any recommendations coming from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an onus on every single person. Every single person that can speak has a responsibility to be part of that transformation that needs to happen. I have taken the recommendations seriously, and I have done my best to incorporate them in the work that we do at the Assembly, but also in calling others out on their failure to implement the recommendations. Because if we don't hold governments and regulatory agencies to account, or companies, corporate interests, then we're failing ourselves and we're failing future generations of our children. This is the impetus that I ventured out and received a legal opinion on the approval of the Enbridge Line 3 replacement project that's going to run through our treaty territories and in through Treaty 2, Treaty 1 territories in Manitoba. And go into the United States through the Gretna Depot in southwestern Manitoba. I believe that there has been a very significant lapse of recognition of the need to implement the recommendations with the prime opportunities that exist in these major infrastructure projects that are coming through, which are going to inform the lives of future generations of our people, either to their detriment or to the positive. So I have taken, the task of seeking leave to appeal the decision. I think that was made public last week, or perhaps the week before, to seek a reconsideration of these processes. I'm a big part of the Treaty Alliance against tar sands expansion. We have 121 member communities across the country. I've been to Quebec to speak to the Mohawks and to build alliance around the pipe with the Mohawks. And I've been on the West Coast with the Coast Salish people to build alliance against tar sands expansion and pipeline expansion that way as well. Because as I said at the outset, if we're going to implement these recommendations, if we're going to live by the discussions we choose to have as a social society, we have to be willing to implement the outcomes and the consequences of our decisions. And that means sometimes that some of these grand ideas that corporate interests have about digging up more greenhouse gas emissions or building more greenhouse gas emissions to the detriment of our children, we've got to get in the way of some of those things. And I believe that's our responsibility. And this responsibility doesn't come lightly, because it comes on the backs of many, many Canadians who have fought and died for the freedom that we have here in these lands that we call Canada today. You see, I've been to discussion spaces in different parts of the world where people are living in exile, people are living in hiding just because they want to talk about rights. I've spoken to some of those people. I've been to the World Forum on Human Rights in Morocco, for example, where people are living in hiding because they're not allowed to talk about rights where they come from, or they'll be tortured and killed. And I believe that we live in a society today, albeit as imperfect as it is, we live in a society that allows for discussions like this to happen, where we can put the tough questions forward. What is the wisdom of the perpetuation and the escalation of greenhouse gas emissions? What is the outcome of that? What are the consequences of that? What can we do towards a just transition in energy development? What can we do to create alternative and efficient energies together, without impacting economically on the wallets of all of us? These are discussions that we need to have, and that's how I believe I live the actions of the recommendations. And I ask all of you to reflect upon, how do you live each of your days in reflection of the actions that you take in implementation of these recommendations? You see, because these are recommendations we cannot put on the shelf, and we cannot allow popular narratives to say that we shelved these things. Because oftentimes I hear people say that we shelved RCAP, and I don't believe we've shelved RCAP. In fact, when you look at Aboriginal rights jurisprudence, you can see references to RCAP throughout the policy arguments and throughout the decisions in many levels of court. We've seen that for many years now. We've seen RCAP implemented in various ways across the country, maybe not to the perfect idea that we hoped it would, but in this type of society, like I said, we're not always going to see the outcomes we think we will. But we live another day to live with the consequences and push for a better tomorrow. So with that said, that is the gist of what I wanted to share with you this evening. I've noticeably been a little bit suffering up here from the cold the flu that I was carrying. I think I'm still trying to work it through the system. But I want to thank you, Sekachimigwech, for your kind ears. I know that some of the things that I can say can be a little bit provocative, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I recognize my visit here on the Treaty 6 lands and all the wonderful people that I've met along the way who live here and call this place home. I just hope that I'm able to share ideas that are going to be workable. And I hope that I bring a little bit of optimism in the message I bring towards, effecting creative and new ways of implementing the TRC recommendations. With that said, I say, Kachimigwech, hi, thank you.